Hello there, and welcome to Cherry Blossom Art's Daily Shakespeare for children of 7+. Today I'm going to be reading the Shakespeare story of Henry V, which I have read a couple of times today and found most enjoyable. Anyway, I wanted to let you know how I got involved in Cherry Blossom Arts. Rebecca, who set it all up, who you'll probably know quite well now, she and I have been friends for a few years and have been involved in acting and directing together at a small country theatre called the Woolstall. And then over the last year or so we've become involved in her Cherry Blossom Arts, and it's a great pleasure and privilege to be able to be doing this today. So, Henry V.
What's your name?
My name's Angus. In case I hadn't said, which I clearly hadn't. Luckily I've got Rebecca here to prompt me. So, Henry V. I'll just tell you about who is involved in this. First of all, I've got the characters there. You see we've got King Henry V. He's a young king. And then we've got the Duke of Exeter, who he relies on for support. That's his uncle. And the Earl of Cambridge. Now, he's a bit of a baddie, really, and you'll find out why in a moment as we start reading. And some smaller parts. There's Michael Williams. He's a soldier in the King's army. And a French ambassador. He doesn't have a name, but he's, yes, he's very flamboyant and he thinks he's rather wonderful, and he isn't. And then there's a French messenger. And it is all set in England and in France. So, right, we'll start the story. Henry V. Hardly anyone called the new king Henry. When they talked about him, they said Hal or Harry, or used one of his other nicknames. Everyone knew what a wild and rebellious teenager the young prince had been. Harry spent more time with rascally old Sir John Falstaff, learning how to drink and gamble, than he had with his royal father. Now the reckless young Harry was king. But no one knew what sort of king he would be. Some thought he would be a disaster. Others said that only time would tell. But all were aware that the young king faced a difficult time as the new English monarch. England and France had been at war for 25 years, and though the two countries had agreed a truce, the truce was an uneasy one. A weak English king, who didn't have the support of his people, might give the French a chance they wanted to carry out a successful invasion. One morning, not long after Henry's coronation, the nobles of the High Council were gathering round in the reception chamber of the King's Palace in London. Among them was the Duke of Exeter, the King's uncle. He likes him. He knew that Henry was now about to face his most challenging test. How young and lonely he looks on that great throne, Exeter thought. He has his mother's dark hair and soft eyes. But does he have any of his father's courage, I wonder? His question was soon answered, for just then the doors of the great chamber opened, and an ambassador from the Dauphin, the Crown Prince of France, entered. The ambassador was a perfumed dandy, with curled beard, and the clothes he wore were as brightly coloured as a peacock's feathers. Behind him, two guards carried a large wooden chest, which they set down on the floor. The ambassador gave an elaborate bow. "Your Highness," he said, in a voice as smooth as honey, "my master, the Dauphin, sends greetings." "I want more than greetings," Henry coldly replied. "I asked King Charles to give me back the French lands that my father won from him. What is his answer?" The ambassador ran his fingers through the curls of his beard and smirked. "The king is busy with important matters," he said. "His Majesty thought that since the Dauphin is closer to you in age, it would be better for him to deal with your request." Henry felt a sting of anger at the ambassador's insolent tone, but he kept his voice calm. "And what is the Dauphin's message?" he asked. "The Dauphin thinks you're a little too young to bother yourself with affairs of state," said the ambassador, gesturing towards the wooden chest. "So he has sent a present, which he thinks will be more suitable than the rights to French dukedoms." The ambassador clicked his fingers, and the guards opened the lid of the chest. It was filled with tennis balls. One of them fell out and rolled to the foot of Henry's throne. The nobles glanced at each other anxiously. King Henry had been insulted and humiliated in front of all his courtiers. How would he respond? Henry leaned over and picked up the ball at his feet. He bounced it once and caught it in his right hand. "Tell the Dauphin that he has begun a game with me that he'll wish he had never started. He said his mockery will turn these tennis balls into cannonballs. The people of France may be laughing at the Dauphin's joke, but they'll weep before I'm finished." The ambassador's face went deathly pale. He bowed low and left the chamber. When the door closed behind him, the nobles began to talk amongst themselves. Most of them glanced admiringly at Henry, but the Earl of Cambridge scowled at the king. He raised his voice above the hubbub in the chamber and said, "Your Majesty spoke hastily. You should have sought the advice of older and wiser men before plunging our country into war." "An insult to me is an insult to the English people," Henry snapped. "And besides, my Lord Cambridge, I don't listen to the advice of traitors." Cambridge started as though someone had jabbed him with a knife point, and his eyes bulged with fear. "You thought that because of my youth I could be easily deceived," Henry went on, "but I've found you out. You betrayed your country for French gold and worked as a spy for King Charles. Guards, take him to the Tower." The nobles stared in astonishment at the disclosure of Cambridge's treachery and at seeing the determination of their young king. He was wiser and stronger-minded than any of them had realized. Men from all over the country answered the young king's call to war with France. Blacksmiths, farm workers, wheelwrights, weavers and clerks all left their homes and marched along the roads that led to Southampton. The younger men thought that war would be a kind of holiday and were eager for fame and glory. Others who had fought before and knew what battle was like were grim-faced and silent. At Southampton, the men began their training. Hour after hour, day after day, they marched and drilled. At the archery butts, men with longbows practiced their aim. It was true. Slowly, the raggle-taggle band of volunteers was transformed into an army. When all was ready, the English battle fleet set sail for the French port of Harfleur. It took all day for Henry's men to cross the channel and unload the ships. The men spent the night on the beach and were woken in the grey hours before dawn to sharpen their weapons and make ready their siege ladders and battering rams. On the skyline, the walls of Harfleur looked like an ominous cloud. And there's a picture of them all waiting to go into Harfleur. When the sun rose, Henry rode out in front of his men on his dapple grey war horse. The early morning light glinted on his armour. "The English are a peaceful nation," he told the troops. "But when war comes, we can fight like tigers." I've got tigers on my chest. My shirt there, you see them? You see those little tigers? They don't look very ferocious, do they? "Let the light of battle blaze in your eyes, to burn the courage of your enemies. Let your cry be, 'God for Harry, England and St. George!'" Cannons roared like a gigantic wave breaking on the shore as the English army charged. By nightfall, Harfleur had fallen. Henry was planning to advance on the port of Calais, which was already in English possession. The next morning, a messenger arrived from King Charles. "The king commands that you surrender to him and leave France while you still can," the messenger declared scornfully. "He is camped at Agincourt with an army of 50,000. If you do not agree to his terms, he will advance and crush you." "Your Majesty," the Duke of Exeter murmured, "we only have 4,000 men. If the French attack us here, all will be lost." "Then we must go to them," Henry said calmly. He turned to the messenger. "Tell King Charles that his army is in my way," he said. "I will march to Agincourt, and, if he does not step aside, the earth will be red with French blood." And so the English advanced to Agincourt and set up camp facing the French, on a plain between two woods. When the French saw the size of the English army, they whistled and cheered, beating their swords against their shields to make a great clamour. But Henry shut his ears to their taunts and concentrated on positioning his forces. He discussed battle plans with his commanders late into the night, and after they had left his tent, Henry tried to rest, but a whirlpool of doubts and fears swirled in his mind, and he could not sleep. Hoping to calm himself, he put on a hooded cloak and went walking through the camp. Men lay asleep, huddled around fires. The air was filled with the sound of snores or voices shouting out in terror through nightmares. Across the plain glimmered the fires of the French camp, as numberless as the stars on a winter's night. Henry was so deep in thought that he didn't notice a sentry guard beside one campfire until he almost walked onto the point of the man's spear. "Who goes there?" barked the sentry. "A friend," Henry replied. "Who is your commander?" "The Duke of Exeter." The guard lowered his spear and pulled a face. "A fine soldier," he grunted. "If he were leading the army instead of the king, we wouldn't be in this mess. I bet young Harry wishes he was back in London, tucked up safe in bed." "The king wishes himself nowhere but here," said Henry. The guard turned his head to spit into the fire. Light from the flames played across his broken nose and the long scar on his left cheek. "Kings," he growled. "They do the arguing, but it's the like of you and me who do the fighting and the dying." "Tomorrow the king will fight in the front line, alongside his men. You will see," said Henry. "I'll wager a week's wages that he'll be at the back, with a fast horse, ready for his escape," the guard said bitterly. "Very well," said Henry. "If we both survive, find me when the battle's over, and we'll see who's right. What's your name?" "Michael Williams," said the guard. "What's yours?" "Harry Leroy," Henry said with a smile, and he passed on and disappeared into the darkness. In the early hours of the morning, a thunderstorm broke. Rain fell mercilessly, drenching English and French alike and turning the plain into a sea of mud. The rain stopped just before dawn, but the sky was still filled with heavy black clouds. The first line of the French army took the field, led by knights on horseback. The plumes on their helmets fluttered brightly against the dark sky, and their armour shone like silver. Behind them ran infantrymen in chain-mail coats, carrying blue shields painted with golden fleur-de-lis. Henry ordered his archers to stand ready and wait for a signal. The French knights broke into a gallop. The hooves of the horses shook the ground, splattered their riders with mud. The knights lowered their lances and screamed out a battle cry. But halfway to the French line, the French horses ran into boggy ground, and the charge faltered. The knights pulled at their reins in panic, turning their horses to try and find firmer footing. The infantrymen caught up, and all was a surging chaos of whinnying horses and cursing men. Henry drew his sword and swept in high above his head. "Fire!" he bellowed. At his command, 1,000 arrows left 1,000 longbows and made a sound like the wind sighing through boughs of a forest. A deadly hail struck the French, piercing armour and flesh and bone. Knights fell from their saddles and startled horses bolted, trampling anyone who stood in their way. Volley after volley of arrows whistled down, until the only movement on the battlefield came from the wounded as they attempted to crawl back to safety. A second line of French troops charged. Once more the English archers stopped them. The French tried to retreat, but ran into their own third line as it came up behind them. It was then that Harry led his men into charge. The two armies met with a clash, like a clap of thunder. The fighting lasted for 2 hours. The French soldiers, dismayed and confused, found that their commanders had been killed, and there was no one to give them any orders. They fought bravely, but the fury of the English attack proved too much for them, and at last they broke ranks and fled. 7,000 Frenchmen died at Agincourt, including many great noblemen. The English only lost 100 men. That night at sunset, a French messenger rode into the English camp, carrying a white flag of truce. It was the same man who had come to Harfleur, but this time he was not haughty. His armour was dented, and there was dirt and blood on his face. "King Charles begs for peace," he said humbly. "He will return all the lands that you claim, and he asks you to accept the hand of his daughter, Princess Catherine, so that your two families may be united in peace forever." "Tell the king that I accept," said Henry. "We will meet and draw up a treaty." That night there were celebrations in the English camp, and just before midnight Henry slipped away from his commanders and went in search of Michael Williams. He found him at the same guard point as on the previous night. When Williams saw Henry, he dropped to one knee. "Your Majesty," he mumbled, "I did not know who you were last night, but I did recognise you today when you led the charge." "So," said Henry, smiling, "I won the wager." "I was a fool to speak to you the way I did last night," the sentry apologetically. Henry put his hand on the man's shoulder and took a bag of gold coins from his belt. He handed it to the astonished guard. "Here," said Henry, "you spoke your mind last night. I hope that honest men will always speak to me as openly as you did." So, King Henry V won a famous victory, and more importantly, he won the hearts of all his subjects. Now they respected him as a ruler, but they also loved him because he understood the lives of ordinary people and was always ready to listen to them. And he won more than his subjects' hearts, for when he met Catherine, the French princess, they fell in love at once, even though she could not speak English and his clumsy French made her laugh. With the marriage, the bitter war with France was ended in feasting and friendship. And that is Shakespeare's story of Henry V. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you will share it with as many people as you wish. And thank you, everyone all around the world, for listening.
And who have we got tomorrow, Angus?
Tomorrow we have got Ali reading The Merchant of Venice. Little prompting. So I hope you enjoy that too. Thank you very much for listening.
Yay! Thank you so much, Angus. I'm socially distanced away from Angus, so
She's miles over there. Left me sitting in the rain.
I gave him an umbrella. Anyway, thanks, Cherry Blossom. Lovely
Thank
to
you.
see you all today.
Bye.
Bye.